Welcome to the Körber-Haus in Bergedorf, and I'd also like to welcome those who are with us via live streaming. My name is Julia Ganter. I'm head of the Department for International Policy at Körber-Stiftung.
We have an event here tonight that we'll conduct in German and English. So if you haven't grabbed one of our translation devices, feel free to do so now. Und auch für unsere deutschsprachigen Gäste hier, die Veranstaltung findet
and for our German-speaking guests, the discussion is going to take place in German and in English. So if you wish to listen to the translation, please avail yourselves of one of the translation devices that are distributed at the entrance. New alliances, new opportunities. Germany and the Global South. This is the motto of today's panel discussion, as you can see on the slide. And with this event, we would like to be part of the Hamburg Sustainability Conference. So this is a cooperation of the city of Hamburg and educational institutions. And yesterday in the town hall of Hamburg, international guests discussed the topic in terms of what we can do to make the world more sustainable and how to achieve the global sustainability goals. And in New York, 2024, 193 nations met in New York to discuss the Agenda 2030. But the track record is rather poor 10 years after the meeting. 17 Sustainable development goals were defined, like no poverty, promoting climate protection. Only 17% of the goals are on track. 50%, in terms of 50% of the sustainable goals, no progress whatsoever has been made, and some are really declining even. But many problems do not have a passport, like climate protection, for instance. Only as the global together as the global community will we be able to resolve these problems. And we would like to seize the opportunity today to talk about the relationships of Germany and the Global South. Last year, we created an initiative together with partners in Brazil, India, and South Africa. We want to, promote the dialogue with the emerging middle powers, as we call them. So we established a report, the Körber Middle Power report, Emerging Middle Power report. It is on display here, and you can also download it on our website. Now, Global South, this is a term that I've used several times, and it's also part of our motto. So the Indian foreign minister said, if you are from the Global South, you will have no problem understanding what the Global South is all about. It's intuitive. But many here are not from the Global South, and for us it may be less intuitive. But I have to disappoint you, because there is no clear definition of what the Global South really is. No definition has been agreed upon, and maybe this will never happen. But we would like to use the term, knowing very well that this includes Latin America, Asia, and Africa, regions that are very diverse in themselves, but who even go beyond this geographical definition. But there are many representatives from these countries, and many use the term Global South to talk about shared challenges that everybody in the Global South is faced with. And these shared challenges of the Global South is what we would like to shed some light on. And we also want to discuss the problems without a passport. Well, our panelists, we're going to focus a bit more on Africa, and we're also going to talk about what Germany's interests are in the Global South. We've invited two guests whom I'd like to ask to come up on stage, Amaka Anku and State Secretary Mr. Annen. Please join me on stage. Before starting with our discussion, I would like to introduce our guest to our audience. Niels Annen, well, from a global perspective, it's a home match for him. He's from Hamburg. But from Hamburg's perspective, the district of Bergedorf is not around the corner of where Mr. Annen was born in Hamburg, which was in Eimsbüttel. And for the Social Democratic Party, you've been a member of the German Parliament since 2005 with one interruption. You also used to be a state minister between 2008 and 2021. And now you are a parliamentary state secretary in the Ministry for Economic Development and Cooperation and Development. Welcome, Mr. Annen. Amaka Anku is an analyst with the consulting firm, the Eurasia Group, based in Washington, D.C., and she is the head of the Africa portfolio. And before that, she used to work for diverse organizations throughout Africa, and she also worked for Schurman and Sterling, a globally operating law firm. She grew up in Enugu in southern Nigeria. And welcome, Amaka, to Bergedorf in Hamburg. Well, what are we going to do today? Well, we've got 1 hour, more or less, and the topics we're going to talk about are very diverse, and we will not be able to talk about everything. So I'd like to encourage you in the second part of the this event to ask your questions, anything that you may feel has not been discussed sufficiently. And 2 colleagues of mine will pass around mobile microphones here. And if you are watching us via the live stream, then you will see a link and a code. And you can use menti.com to ask your questions. And my colleague is then going to read out the questions to us so that we will be able to answer your questions. So I've done a lot of talking, and now it's up to you. Niels Annen. Well, the former Chancellor Willy Brandt, also member of the Social Democratic Party, already member of the North-South Commission, demanded more respectful dealing with the countries of the Global South. But so far, nothing much has happened. Not many goals have been implemented. And at a press conference in the 1980s, in 1981 to be precise, he said, I quote, German policy is backward and the intelligentsia in this country is even more backward. That's quite a harsh statement. And so I'm asking you, what do you think Willy Brandt would say today if he had to pass a judgment on the German policy with the Global South? Well, that's a difficult question. That's a tough one. But thank you very much for the invitation. And for Social Democrats, it's really difficult to make the impression that we speak on behalf of Willy Brandt. Maybe he would be a bit more satisfied today because the German Chancellor invited the global community to join the Hamburg Sustainability Conference to talk not just about the Global South, but also with the representatives of the Global South, government representatives, representatives of civilian society, and also with companies from the Global South. This was an important step. I'm very motivated to be here today. I just arrived here a couple of minutes ago, coming from the German City Hall. And it's a good reason to have this conference. It's the major sustainable development goals the global community has agreed upon. These goals have not yet been achieved. We are not on track. We are lagging behind. And this is a dramatic statement, really. And so we need to talk about this much more. We need to get active now, and this was one of the purposes of the Sustainability Conference. So there is one major political differences compared to the time Willy Brandt was lived in. We do not have Cold War anymore. countries of the global south are not waiting for countries like Germany to take care of their problems. They've got their own stance and their own confident position, and they are also economically successful. The world we live in is highly complex. It has changed very much. There are new kids on the block, and we shouldn't be afraid of our position. We need to work together to cooperate with the representatives of the Global South to face the major challenges that we share. And this is the message coming from Hamburg. So you said it's not about talking about the Global South, but with the Global South. Amaka Anku, you flew here yesterday from Africa, and you traveled a lot around Africa. So my first question to you, how is Germany perceived in the African countries you visited?
Well, first, thank you, Julia, for having me, and for, I guess, the rest of the German government for inviting me to the HSC conference. How is Germany perceived? So I would say that the first thing that to sort of anchor that question, I would say that not a lot of people understand what the Germans' interests are in Africa. So that's a starting point, right? And I say that because if you think about, from my perspective as an African and talking to a lot of African policymakers, we know exactly what China's interests are in Africa. We know exactly what American interests are in Africa. We know exactly what French interests are in Africa. And I can tell you what each of those are, right? Like China, France wanted to basically prolong its colonial relationship and its colonial influence, right? That's why we talk about Franc-Afrique. And obviously there's now been quite a, I would say, a fallout. There's been a big fallout now in Francophone Africa with rising anti-French interests, which we can talk about if anybody wants to get into that. But that is effectively was France's interest, to sort of promote its own sort of ability to project power on the global stage by retaining its influence in its former colonial powers. And we can talk so much more about that, but I don't want to get too carried away. In China's interests, I think also, however, is very clear in that it wasn't a colonial power, and it, I would say maybe from the early 2000s, came on the scene saying, look, we want new markets for our goods, and importantly, diplomatically, we want support at the UN for some of our political interests. Example, recognition of Taiwan, right? And so a lot of countries that became a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, you'll see one by one, they all stopped recognizing Taiwan. So it was diplomatic clouds, votes at the UN, a place to sell their goods to, and in exchange, get mineral resources. Clear. US interests, right? So US interests are primarily to project its values, democracy, want people to look more like the US, and keep threats at bay, and now counter China. But I think there is a lack of clarity about exactly what the German interests are. So I would say that would be one of the perceptions, right? Is that we don't really know. It's new, it's more recent. So I'll stop there because I know I've been talking and let you ask any further questions.
Herr Annen, da frage ich doch Sie direkt einfach mal, was ist denn das deutsche Interesse?
Okay, Mr. Annen, so let me ask you, what are Germany's interests? Yes, I think it's a legitimate question. It's a good question. And if I may just anticipate this, I could say, well, there is no tradition in Germany of defining national interests. Of course, our country, just as every other country, has its interests. But we have a very specific and terrible history. The integration of Germany into the European Union from a political and economic perspective and also the very solid integration in the Western military alliances, are things that spared us this question for many years. Why? Because we are one of the world's largest economies. We rely heavily on exportations, and of course we are interested in open markets. We are interested in healthy partnerships with neighboring countries, but of course also because we're interested in them buying our not so cheap products. And, well, we haven't been able to spend much on defense in the past, and that is where we have had an interest in the past, and we still have that interest, for the world to be a peaceful place. However, the world has grown in complexity. Some of this has been caused by external shocks, if you so want. For instance, the Russian war of aggression. The fact that the Russian side breached their contractual obligations, that they are no longer supplying gas and other things. And of course, there's something that is being discussed quite intensively. And all of these developments have led Germany to define its interests more strongly. The so-called Zeitenwende in Germany is one expression of that phenomenon, but also in the federal government or the parliament, there is now a national security strategy. And for most countries that we work with, that is something that is completely normal. It's a political exercise to regularly define your national interests, not only for yourself, but also in order to create clarity for your partners, allowing others to read up on it. The Americans do that, the French, the Brits. But we didn't do that in the past because we thought we probably don't even need this. Now, this is something that's changed. The Federal Chancellor yesterday opened the Hamburg Sustainability Conference. And at this opening, I believe he answered part of your question, if I'm not wrong. What he said was that we are in the midst of a profound transformational process in terms of energy, in terms of our economic model. Our city of Hamburg here is a city that lives off its industry, of course. Many people don't even know that. The steel industry, chemicals industry, copper industry, aluminium industry. We need lots and lots of energy, and that is why we are investing in a new hydrogen network. We built LNG terminals in record-breaking time. We are changing legal frameworks. We are creating the basis for long-term economic relationships. And that is to say, relationships with those countries that are in a position to produce the hydrogen that we need in a green way. And this includes many African countries, not exclusively, but some of them are African countries. Now, this is one of Germany's interests. Now, with regards to development policies, our interest is that, of course, in this new world of the energy revolution, we do not want to reproduce old dependencies. We want to use this transformation, this revolution, in order to ensure that the countries that we want to trade with on a long-term basis can actually participate in this, take part in the know-how, and also are able to address energy deficits or developmental deficits. And this also means for us to invest in education, for instance. But of course, all of this will only work out if we create a stable framework for this. It's not only about money that you, as taxpayers, give to the federal government. This concept only works if our companies actually invest. But companies only invest when the conditions are predictable. And this leads us to the topic of good governance, for instance, for the creation of peace, and so on and so forth. So Germany has very clear interests, and I think this federal government, which is often criticized, has actually recognized one thing. And I would like to mention the Federal Chancellor here first and foremost, namely it has recognized that we need a different kind of relationship with the countries that we enter into long-term partnerships with, or relationships. And that's why we invited many of them here to Hamburg, not only now, but also for the G7 summit. The Federal Chancellor travels a lot. He travels a lot to Africa, a lot more than his predecessors. And he also fosters personal relationships. That too is important in today's world. So I cannot answer your question in very concrete terms, because we are still on the way, let's say, but I think the outlines of this answer are becoming more visible than they were in the past. Yes, I think we were also able to follow your line of thought earlier on, because you mentioned many different topics, and I think we will be following up on a number of them in our conversation. Now, one thing that I would like to highlight is the green transformation. Now, specifically with regard to Africa, this is an important topic also for the relationships with Germany and different countries on the continent. Amaka, the German climate attaché, when she was in Africa, said there is huge untapped potential and that 60% of the best locations for solar cells are in Africa, but only 1% of the globally installed solar capacity can actually be found on the African continent. So the problem is that there is a lack of investment. Now, as I said in the beginning, in my introduction, you work at the Eurasia Group and you also do risk consulting for investors. And Mr. Annen actually mentioned investment just now. So why is this potential untapped? Why do we have a lack of investment?
Very good question. So look, I do think that this is an area where Germany's interests and the interests of many African countries can meet, right? I mean, look, as you know, most African countries are very young, right? They're on the western side about 60-something years old, these countries. And in Southern Africa, they're even younger because there were wars of independence in the 1970s. One of the biggest challenges that a lot of these countries face is lower state capacity, right? And I say that in terms of administrative capacity, right? But also, and I think these two are connected, mobilizing revenue, capital flows, right? And because there is limited external capital inflows, or I would say into a lot of these countries, and there are often very large informal sectors related to, lower administrative capacity. It's hard for them to collect a lot of revenue from their populations. And so it's hard to make the kinds of investments in solar energy and renewable energy that is, required, I would say, for the global energy transition. And so I do think that this is an area where, where the interests of Germany, for example, can meet the interests of many African countries because they need the capital to help develop some of these resources. And in exchange, Germany can use some of its technologies and, can be deployed in some of those places. And that's exactly what China did, right, for the last 20-something odd years, which is that there was a recognition that African countries needed physical infrastructure that its kind of more traditional partners weren't providing. A lot of Africa's Western partners were focused so much on political processes and rights. Is there an election? And, and less on, what I call value promotion, and less on concrete, actual economic partnership. And that's provided an opening for China to come in and give loans and invest in building the bridges and the roads and the dams and things that you actually need to make your economy competitive. So I do think this is an opportunity, especially given the global energy transition and Germany's need for green energy. It's an opportunity for Germany to do that before somebody else sees that opportunity and dominates the space. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Ein Bereich, in dem viel Investment mobilisiert wurde, ist in Nigeria.
Money has been raised, particularly in Nigeria. Recently was the oil and gas industry. In 2023, one of the world's largest oil refinery was opened in Nigeria, and the production of more and more fossil energy sources has taken place, and many who deal with the topic of climate protection and climate change are afraid of this development. They are aghast at this development. How is this viewed in Nigeria? Is this good news or bad news?
It's very good news. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I think despite a lot of, we understand that the world will transition, needs to transition, but we also understand that the shipping industry, right, aviation, there are industries that it will take, they're very, 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 very far, right, from transitioning to fully green energy sources. We will still need fossil fuels for a very long time. And in particular, in a country like Nigeria, where you still don't have energy security. This is what I mean. You still have a lot of people who don't have access to electricity. The priority is to get people access to electricity and to get people access to energy before we start worrying about whether it's clean or not, right? And this goes into the debates about should certain regions of the world have more time to adjust. I mean, all the pollution. A lot of African countries are, I would say, suffering the most from the effects of climate change, even though they weren't the ones that polluted the air as much as they are. But look, in order to power Africa's industrialization, there is still going to be a lot of need for fossil fuels and gasoline, right? And so this is great news, and it's great news, in my view, for accelerating economic growth, actually, which we can talk about.
Herr Annen, afrikanische Länder sitzen, so schätzt man das zumindest,
well,
auf einem
African
Öl- und
countries
Gasvorkommen
have oil
von
and gas
10 Billionen
reserves
US-Dollar.
of
Würden Sie
$2 trillion US, 10 trillion. If they were to follow the same industrialization trajectory, then their share of global emissions would go up from 4 to 40%, and this would lead to global warming of around about 4 degrees, according to these estimates. Well, do you think that economic development in the global south can ever be climate friendly? Yeah, this could work, and it has to work, to be honest. But we need to be clear about one thing, and the answer showed this very clearly. The climate transition at an international scale can only work out if we are all committed to this goal. And I mean, the Western countries, they have a historical CO2 footprint that has caused the crisis we're in. And so politically, it's not possible to prohibit the poorer countries not to invest in their industrialization. Does that mean that I'm happy about this kind of investment? Certainly not. But this goes to show how difficult and how challenging the situation really is. And we've got a lot of partners who do both things. They invest in existing fossil energies, and as a general rule, Germany does not provide any monetary support for this. I mean, of course, we know that there is a need for short-term industrialization and economic development, and this is often forgotten in the public debate in Germany, because the farther away the country is, the more fundamental our basic environmental stance is. But the point that you made is very important. If I have a look at a country as Kenya, for instance, a close partner of Germany in development cooperation, Kenya has a leading position when it comes to renewable energy. I think the share in Kenya is 60%. 60% of their energy is green.
It's like 85%. Yeah. Sorry.
All the better. So this is a benchmark. Not even Germany is able to achieve this at the moment. So we need to discuss this very openly and honestly. The global power system has changed. We cannot tell a country like Nigeria what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. This is not possible. And this power shift This is a factor that is often underestimated in the public debate in Germany, and this makes many things very difficult, because we do not live in a world that is divided by Cold War anymore, and the war was particularly cold in Europe, and in many countries in Africa it was a hot war and not a Cold War, and we need to really acknowledge this, and we need to find a new way of debating things, a new type of dialogue. And once per year, the world meets. The next COP conference is going to take place in Baku, and after that in Brazil, in the middle of the Amazonian basin. And the African countries, they organized their own conference before the last major climate conference, with their own goals and objectives. And even though we have not arrived at the same results, we do support this, because this is part of the new normalcy. I'd like to get back to one point that you mentioned, that we all need to get involved and committed. And you mentioned some positive examples from African states where things work much better than in Germany. And so the German policymakers also need to be involved. One example from Hamburg, a German investor such as the Johannes Schütze AG, they also initiate new gas projects in Nigeria. So new gas fields need to be developed, and in the media you can read that Mr. Scholz, the federal chancellor, visited Nigeria last year, and he supported this development, and at the same time he also supports the expansion of the development of green energy, and for this $4 billion have been provided. Well, the federal chancellor has been criticized for this. He also visited Senegal, and the Senegalese government is looking for partners for the development of a new gas field. So I'm asking myself, what moral justification do we have to tell countries such as Nigeria and Senegal that we don't support this? I mean, we are also in a difficult situation with the lack of gas supplies from Russia, and at very short notice, we were looking for new suppliers for LNG to make sure that nobody had to freeze during the last winter, and we managed to do this. But this has really completely changed the LNG market on a global scale, because Germany has a lot of economic weight, and the increasing demand coming from Germany has led to increased prices. And you know, these LNG tanks with this dome-shaped structure, and they have been purchased off the market, really. There is this tracking app, and we found that many ships changed their routes and were relocated towards Germany, because we bought the LNG on these ships. And we wanted to make sure that we have had enough gas, and so we can't prevent others from doing the same. And at the same time, we need to talk about what we can do to achieve climate goals, how we can get back on a track. So, because we are all affected by this. We are all in the same boat, and the climate change, this is not an invention. This is reality. And today it is not enough I mean, it is clear that industrialized countries such as the US and Germany are the countries that are most responsible for the climate change, and many countries have pointed this out, and there are many emerging countries who are also responsible for carbon emissions. And maybe in the future they will even reach the same footprint that Germany has got. And so we need to do both things. But we cannot say you must not do this, that, and the other, and withholding loans, for instance. It may sound like a contradiction, but it is none, because there are many African countries who invest massively in renewable energy, and we cooperate with funding institutions such as the World Bank to make sure that the money gets where governments are willing to invest in green energy. And at the moment, the majority of environmental funds are spent in Germany. But it makes a lot of sense also to invest monies in countries where it makes more sense. And very often it's not just black and white. And so this is why there are always these debates about contradictions. Well, let's focus on another topic. China has been mentioned several times, and China is a very important global player. And also in the global south overall. Amaka, China, many countries in the global south are impressed by China because of their economic growth and their success stories. They have helped millions of people to leave poverty behind. It's an alternative development trajectory. Even though they do not have a democratic tradition of this, how attractive do you think the Chinese model is in the global south?
Okay, so that's a tricky question. So I'm going to answer it in two strands, okay? And there's been surveys done of African opinions in terms of how people think about China as a model and the West. And if you ask most Africans, do they admire the Chinese political system? Would they like to go live in China? Most people say no. Most people do not want to live in an authoritarian society without political freedoms. But at the same time, political freedom you cannot sustain political freedom without economic freedom. And so if you ask people what you think about the achievements that China has been able to make in its economy in terms of lifting people out of poverty, people are impressed by that in Africa. And I think where that leaves us is, how do we think about, the benefits of the democratic tradition in terms of the outcomes we want, not the processes? Because a lot of the rhetoric in the West tends to get too caught up in the processes. Did they have an election? Can they say this and that? Did somebody lose an election, right? That's all good, but we're now in a space, and if you look at the African continent, there are outliers. The places where most Africans live, the most populous countries, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, those people are very well entrenched in the democratic traditions, right? And nobody wants to be authoritarian. So we don't need to focus that much on that anymore, right? And that's where the focus on economic cooperation and economic transformation, which is where the cooperation with China tends to focus on, becomes more attractive. Okay, we don't need lectures about why it's so good to be democratic. People know, they get it. We're moving on. But now, if people start to feel, and that's where we're getting at, there's been recent surveys where people start to feel like the democracy they have is not working for them in terms of actual roads that they can drive on, electricity that they can use, security, just of their livelihoods, then it will actually threaten your ability to maintain the free and open political systems, right? And so I think, the point here is just being able to figure out where your common interests lie in terms of economic transformation is attractive. And that's what China has done. And that's why it has become an attractive partner for trade and for other kinds of economic cooperation. And I think there's a lesson there for other Western partners.
Sozusagen ein Beispiel für uns in Europa, hast du jetzt eben genannt.
You just mentioned one example for us in Europe, economic cooperation and not so much of a focus on the processes and elections as the only indication of the democratic state a country is in. Are there any other recommendations that you could make, or anything that Germany could learn from China when it comes to the cooperation with the Global South, and things that Germany should avoid?
So one thing that comes to mind as I'm thinking about this is I know that one of Germany's interests for a while has been to have veto power at the UN Security Council. No? No, it's not anymore. To have a permanent interest? No? Okay. But I would say that one of the things that thinking strategically, about your ability to have diplomatic support for whatever your global priorities are. Maybe it's Ukraine, right? Maybe it's not UN Security Council. Maybe it's Ukraine. Maybe it's something else, right? The way you engage, when you articulate your clear interests and find a way where it's, meeting your other partner's clear interests, not just rhetoric, right? Then you're more likely to get them to be on your side on some of the other things you might want to achieve, right? So that's how so whatever it is, so it's economic cooperation, but there's also potential for other, I would say, diplomatic support and other kinds of priorities that you might have. I don't know if there was anything else you had in mind with that question. No, okay.
Herr Annen, wo wir schon über China in Afrika,
talking about China in the Global South and in Africa, and China's strategy. What's exemplary is the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road. More than 1,000 bridges, 100 ports and 10,000 of railroad tracks have been built in Africa since 2010. That's what the Chinese government keeps telling. I didn't count this. And we try to come up with similar initiatives. The EU, for instance, kicked off the Global Gateway Initiative, and by 2027 they want to invest 300 billion euros in Africa. As a counter-initiative to the Belt and Road Initiative China kicked off. And under the impression of the Sustainability Conference, where we try to promote and foster similar goals, why do we have to see China as a competitor in the Global South? Why do we have to offer an alternative? Why can't we just cooperate with China by way of a triangular cooperation?
Let me speak to that. I would like to say, yes, it is true. Germany has certain ambitions. It would like to be a permanent member of the Security Council. However, we also would like to see a reform of the Security Council. So it's not only about the right to veto. And I think if this should ever happen or materialize, then it wouldn't mean that Germany would receive a vetoing right. Well, let's see what's going to happen. There's been some movement. The Americans have moved their position slightly, but we also would like to see the Security Council to be more representative, because there is no permanent African member, for instance, or no Latin American member. But yeah, I didn't want to try to avoid your question. Now, the German and European policies vis-à-vis China functions in a sort of threefold way. It's both a partner and a competitor and a rival. But what I think is important is that we actually consider all of these three aspects, because you said it. The measures that have been taken are things that can be discussed. But there is no country that has lifted so many people out of poverty as China has. And it has done so at record-breaking speed. And this has come at a cost, socioeconomic cost, political cost. But we already heard the quote of Philipp Brandt in the beginning. And in this context, I can say that we have been talking about combating poverty for decades. We have defined various goals and the sustainability goals of the United Nations, and we have not achieved these goals. And China, on the other hand, even though the figures might be controversial, has probably lifted 400 to 600 million people out of poverty and lifted them into a relatively prosperous society. And whoever does not recognize this achievement has to rethink. I do not have to agree with the measures. I am a very convinced Democrat. I believe in democratic values, and these are certainly not the basis for the Chinese success, but success is there nonetheless. And at the same time, China also has very strong interests when it comes to power and their politics, and these sometimes stand in contrast to our own policies. Not always, but sometimes, and this is just part of what politics is. Now, when there is such a big continent with such a big need for investment as Africa has, and you see that you leave it up to one single country with regard to investments and infrastructure, then we see the following. And well, you asked about my interests, so let me speak to that. Then I have to say this, of course, influences our political interests, because obviously there is one country that is investing, a country that is making know-how available and giving out loans, and that creates a very specific relationship. And it cannot be in our interest to see that in our direct neighborhood, and I say it like that purposefully, I think people don't realize that, but Africa is not that far away. Especially in times of connectivity and transport, where all of this is so easy, I think we have to really remember that they are very close to us. And so this is not intelligent politics. And so we have to be better at this. It's not about imitating the Chinese model. This is also not in line with our general principles or our convictions. But not everything that China did in Africa is wrong. And German companies also profit from roads being built, and if there are trains and there are airports and ports. But many of these things have not been financed in a sustainable way. And our partners in Africa often say that, be it behind closed door. They say, we would have preferred to do this with you. And what we see in African states is that there are sometimes, or have sometimes been, big demonstrations because the political situation was unsatisfactory. And that has, in part, something to do with the level of debt. Many African states are highly indebted nowadays. And at times where I demonstrated against the World Bank when I was still young, now I go to the annual conferences of the World Bank as a German representative, which is a curious experience in itself. But anyway, at the time, the Western countries were responsible for most of this debt. When the Paris Club, the club of Western donor countries, meet, they don't have much to decide, because most of this is Chinese debt nowadays. And so for that reason, I think we need to actually look at this or approach this with a certain level of pragmatism, but also with a very clear understanding of our own interests. And there's another point that I would like to make. You might be surprised about this, but there are corporations with China, German-Chinese development cooperation in third countries. Small projects that are not very visible, but for instance, general education is one of the topics that are tackled there, because we think that we have to talk to each other. We need to look at how the Chinese do things, how we do things, and I think this is very reasonable. Thank you. Yes, you actually mentioned a topic that we certainly have to talk about, namely money. It is a very important topic when it comes to sustainable development goals, because there is a financing gap in the sustainability goals. Up to $4 million US per year is the estimated sum of this gap, and the question is, where should this money come from? So I think in current times it's actually worth looking at what Germany is spending its money on and what it's not spending money on. And at the moment, in Germany's budget for next year, in the development ministry, there has been a decline in the budget. The defense budget is 5 times as big as the budget of the Federal Ministry for Cooperation and Development. And we have also mentioned the war in our neighborhood in Ukraine, the war of aggression, the Russian war of aggression. Since the beginning of this war, Germany has spent 33.9 billion euros on this, 4 billion for renewable energies in Africa, stands in contrast to that. So, Amaka, the priorities that Germany sets here with regard to African countries that you know, are these priorities understood, or is there any understanding for these kinds of priorities, especially when it comes to the financing gaps in the SDGs?
Very good question. So first, I just want to say something about debt to China, right, which Mr. Annen mentioned, because I think there is a misperception, especially in the Western media, about the nature of Chinese debt. So I'm just going to say this quickly and then move on, which is that the most African debt now is owed to China. That's actually not true. Most bilateral debts, i.e., a lot of Western countries don't loan money directly to African governments. They do it through the multilateral institutions like IMF and World Bank. So actually, if you look at the numbers, which I do for work, it's about 20%, maybe maximum 30% of African external debt is owed to China. Most of the debt is owed to IMF, World Bank, multilateral institutions, and Western bondholders. What we call Eurobonds, right, on the international capital market. So I just want to say that because that's something that gets repeated a lot. It's actually not most debt. It's still mostly multilateral institutions and private creditors. But your question is very important because, like I was, as I was preparing for this, I read up about the Marshall Plan for Africa, which was announced by the German government in 2017, right? Which was a recognition, like you said, that development goals, a lot of Africa's development goals require a lot of financing. And back to your first question, you asked about the perception. A lot of people like me had really never heard about the Marshall Plan for Africa, or if we haven't really seen anything. It's not concrete. It sounds like fluffy words. It just sounds like words, right? And a lot of Africans are used to, we're used to governments saying things that they don't do. A lot of African governments say things that they don't do, right? So that's what it sounds like. It just sounds like, here's another fancy thing. Even the $4 billion that you talked about, it hasn't been spent. There's an announcement that they will spend 4 billion, it wasn't $4 billion, I think it was 4 billion euros, right? They will spend 4 billion euros over 7 years or something. Again, is it going to materialize? We don't know. And to be clear, this reality goes for China as well. It's just that the numbers they give, when they do the FOCAC, the cooperation with China, there's often announcements of $60 billion, whatever billion, and like some of it, the difference is that they're talking so large numbers that even if 10-20% of that comes through, it's still way more significant than what Western partners are promising. So I guess all of that to say that the reality, and this is a part of the perception, to your first question, is that a lot of countries like Germany have not actually put their money where their mouth is. There's been a lot of talk about the Global Compact. There's been a lot of talk about, China, they're not good for human rights, don't work with them, they're not transparent, work with us, but where is the money? Show us the money, right? And so that is something that I'm sure you've heard from your African policymakers. So.
Bevor ich es für unser Publikum für die Fragen öffne, Herr Annen, will ich Ihnen kurz die Gelegenheit geben,
before I move on to the question and answer session, I would like to give you the possibility
mit Afrika zu verteidigen, wenn Sie möchten.
To defend the Compact for Africa and the Marshall Plan, if you so want. Yes, I would like to say something about that, and please don't get me wrong. I think the Marshall Plan was based on good intentions. It was a project of the German Ministry for Development at the time, under Minister Gerd Müller. And my minister, Svenja Schulze, decided to discontinue this program, partly because the Marshall Plan creates expectations or dimensions that weren't realistically achievable with the funds that it involved. So we are no longer talking about the Marshall Plan for Africa. But please let me say this, the compact with Africa, which is something that you may have heard of, or maybe not. This was an agreement that was made in Hamburg. It was made by Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel at the time and a number of reform-oriented African governments, as they said at the time. And it's a result of the G20 summit in Hamburg. So there are actual results of this summit, not only the results that we remember as citizens of Hamburg. And Christa Georgieva, the head of the International Monetary Fund, actually mentioned it at the conference yesterday in Hamburg. She said that this compact has actually taken effect already. It has produced results, maybe not the desired results, but there are many reasons for that. One of them is COVID. And there's another topic that I can only mention briefly because we're running out of time. But not everything that was promised involved German taxpayers' money. It was also about investments being channeled towards those countries. And there are many reasons why that didn't happen sufficiently, and we have to talk about that, of course. Now let me say one thing in our defense, because I have to disagree in one point. Anything that Germany promises with regard to financial means or funds is actually registered in the German budget. And you can read up on it. In the Development Ministry, most of the money that we have available is spent in Africa with African partners. We talk to our partners about the projects or what we do there. And I don't want to talk about other countries, but there are many other countries that make promises. And that's not only China. It's also other countries that are very close to us. These countries make promises, but they don't register those in their budgets. And they earn big rounds of applause, organize big conferences, and then nothing happens. And I'm very open to criticism. It's never enough. The things we mobilize are never enough. But what we promise is actually what we spend. And I'm very happy to send you our budget with the relevant figures. I did look at the tables the other day. I think it does take some time to really get through to all of them. It's very complex. But anyway, let me give you the chance to answer your questions. We have two colleagues in the room who have microphones. So please give me a show of hand if you would like to ask a question. Just about the rules of the games, you can ask in German or in English, however you please. Just please introduce yourselves and tell us who you're asking the question, who you're addressing the question to. And please remember that a question ends with a question mark, and if you can keep it simple and short and simple, that would be good. So, great. Right in front here, second row, we have a question.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kawala. I come from Cameroon and I live in Cameroon. I am a development actor. I own a business and I'm a political leader in Cameroon. I'm so sorry because I'm going to be a little bit long just because there is no African voice in this room. I'm so sorry. I love Amaka, my sister from Nigeria, but this happens all the time. Diaspora is not Africa. And there were a lot of us in Hamburg. We needed to be in this room to talk about Africa. Because there's a couple of things. We are, for the most part, thank God for the few countries that are succeeding in governance. But for the most part in Africa, we are badly governed. for the most part in Africa, we live in full or semi-autocracies. And for the most part in Africa, we are not getting access to the most basic of services: water, electricity, roads, and so on. Let's start from there. In Europe, people are always shy to say that. These are the facts of what we are living. And for us in Africa, this bad governance includes state capture, it includes corruption, the non-delivery of these basic services, which eventually lead to conflict. And we have arrived at this situation by our governments in explicit or implicit complicity with the Western world, both its private sector and its public sector. And that's what upsets us about the West. That's what upsets us about the West. And the reason China and Russia can seem attractive at times is just simply because they're not part of that history. So if we need to transform today, which we absolutely need to do, and Africans want both democracy, we have Afrobarometer, the polls show it, 67% of Africans want democracy, and we want roads and so on.
I'm really grateful that you're raising your voice.
Yes.
And I hear that you have many interesting things
Yes.
to say, but in the interest of time, please give others also the opportunity
my
to
last
talk.
sentence on this is that if we are thinking about transforming how we have been cooperating together, this means that for a country like Germany, you have to think about synergizing what you are doing in development through BMZ and GIZ, what you are doing at the IMF, where you are one of the strongest contributors, and what you are doing militarily with Europe. On the ground, these things are not synergized, and they do not center this question of human rights and governance, which are for Africans central.
Thank you. Ich lasse Sie reagieren, wenn wir noch mehr Wortmeldungen gehört haben. Hier in der zweiten Reihe war noch eine.
There is another question in the second row.
Dankeschön. Also Tobias Ergenzinger, mein Name. Und
Tobias Ergenzinger, and I have a question for Mr. Annen. You mentioned green energy as an example of our interests. Are there any other things that could come from Germany? What else could Germany supply? Technology was mentioned. Are there any other aspects? Is there a third question? If not, there you go. In the last row. Thank you very much. My name is Dieringer, and I deal a lot with spending and the cutbacks. This has been touched upon. And my question, how can it be that in times that are so important with the current political situation, why could anyone possibly come up with financial cuts in the ODAs, the official development aid? And we talked about financing immigrants in our own country, and of course it is difficult to draw a clear line here. And I would like to know the following. How can you expect long-term cooperation with the African continent if we have a look at our current budget that is being discussed? Is there any hope in the Foreign Office and in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development? Is there any leeway for more funds to be raised? And let me pass these questions back to you, Amaka. Maybe you would like to respond to the first statement, also in terms of the synchronization of or synergization of the different initiatives, and the other two questions we've heard.
Okay. So I think I'm glad that my you call me your sister, so I'll also call you my sister here, is here to remind us that there are many different voices inside and outside Africa. And for the most part, in many countries, in most countries, most of those voices are being heard in the political process, right? Again, unlike in some places, I know that unlike in some places, like China is the elephant in the room. And yeah, I mean, you did say that you're from Cameroon, which obviously has had the same leader for decades, right? So I understand your very particular concerns. But I want to say, which to me, this is very important, and I feel very strongly about this, that a weak state anywhere in the world cannot guarantee human rights and security for its citizens, right? So ultimately, and this is why when I say ultimately, the focus on, even if you want to focus on human rights and governance, it still has to be done by empowering states. States that can collect taxes, states that can build infrastructure, states that have the administrative capacity to do things that will ensure that people have the freedoms, right? And so that's why I say that we cannot only focus on the processes. And I also want to say that, a lot of people, even in Africa, want to keep coming back to this question of governance and human rights. The reality is, most countries will, and how that should color, that we should center that in our relationship with the West or with other partners. I actually disagree. I think that is already too centered. Because in some of the places, when we think about China, for example, which we have talked about a lot in this room, billions of investment dollars went from Europe, including Germany, to locate manufacturing in China, despite lots of human rights concerns, lots of governance concerns. My point being that countries will act in their economic self-interests, right? And so, not saying that is not important, that is very important, but ultimately the way to ensure that people's human rights and governance is being sort of centered is by making sure that the states in Africa are strong enough to do that.
Dankeschön.
Ja, vielen Dank. Viele Fragen und
thank you very much. Many questions, and we could probably hold an entire seminar on this statement from Cameroon. But it is important to say that we are pursuing a policy that is based on values. And we, as the German Development Ministry, well, often it's a misconception that I keep hearing from representatives from the civilian society, particularly from Africa. We do not give money to governments. Very rarely would we make an exception in particular situations where we support a government with our budget. But if we do this in a very transparent way, because this money would have to be posted as an income in the balance sheet, if you so will. But basically, we don't do this as a matter of principle. So we do this via institutions, the Society for International Cooperation. We negotiate with our partners in which sectors we make investments, and this includes our interests, but we also listen to the voice of our partners in the other countries. And the question, how many partner countries of the Federal Development Ministry are not governed according to the democratic standards that we are used to. And this is not a trivial issue. But in Bergedorf or Berlin, around the green table, we cannot decide how a company should develop. We can only make contributions. And the world has become very complex with many confident players. And if we point out human rights, and quite rightly so. If we do this, this is our own decision, and this decision does not only come from our government, but also from our society. Sometimes our expectations may seem contradictory. We want to do more for development, but at the same time, we want to make sure that democratic conditions are met and that a dialogue on a par is pursued. And the cutbacks that you mentioned, the monetary, I find this painful myself, that we do not have more money at the moment in our budget. But maybe it's helpful to explain what ODA is, the official development aid. This is not the name of a river, which would be ODA, but it's the official abbreviation for official development aid, or official development assistant. It's the ODA quota, 0.7% of the GDP. This is what we are committed to. And the OSZE monitors this in detail. The OECD, that is. This year, next year, we won't manage. We will manage this year, but probably not next year. It's a complex matter, and I don't want to bore you with statistics, but indeed, costs that we spend for the accommodation of immigrants in Germany will be offset against the ODA quota, and other countries did the same thing. So we will have less money available. That's true, and it's painful, and I'm definitely not happy about this. At the same time, though, since the pandemic, we have taken out many loans, and so the finance minister, if he were here, would point this out again. If we took the situation before COVID, then our spending would have even increased. That's also part of the truth. And you all know, those who, observe daily politics. The Liberal Democratic Party is very keen on limiting state debt, and in 1 year's time you will have the opportunity to elect a new government, and the next federal government, however it might look, I believe that Olaf Scholz will remain federal chancellor, but maybe we may have to rethink our notion of limited debts, and I hope that we will, and then we would have more money to spend on development aid. But nevertheless, Germany is the second largest donor for development aid and the fourth largest donor within the UN. Skilled labor. We are interested in skilled labor. We've changed the law. Now it's possible. So skilled labor can also come from African countries, from Kenya, for instance. And there is an agreement signed between President Ruto and Olaf Scholz. And there are questions that we will have to answer. But it is in our best interest to have skilled labor here because our population is shrinking and our economic growth will depend on this. Thank you.
So may I just ask you to keep your answers short too, but could I ask whether there are any people connected to us via live stream who would like to ask a question? Or are there any questions in the room? We can still take one more question. Okay, I have 3 of them. I need the microphones, please. So if you can promise that you'll keep it short. I'd like to take a question from the first row. Thank you. My name is Thomas Römer. I'm from Hamburg. I have a very short question. What will the world look like in 5 years' time? What will have changed? Okay, thank you. Could you keep it just as short? Let me give it a try. My name is Horst Meinhardt. What I notice is that China, or the Chinese, when they do something, they do the full thing. So let me say, they build an 800-kilometer long railroad track, they provide the trains, they provide the tracks, they the train drivers are also trained, meaning the entire package, and it is a rather challenging package in its implementation, is realized. And if they need a harbor, a port, then they obviously create a huge export harbor if they need to. And they have a very holistic way of thinking in that sense. And I think for the African continent or for one or the other country, that is fantastic. And they only have to say yes to it and they get it. And us Germans, we do piecemeal things. We do little projects here and there. So what's the question? Shouldn't we adopt the Chinese approach? Okay, keep it short, please. My name is Werner. Many are under the impression that the things that we start actually run aground or somewhat become irrelevant over time because they cannot actually be implemented. And can we not do anything in this regard to ensure that the investments that we do actually have long-term results? Thank you. So let me say, what will the world look like in 5 years? You both may answer that question. And then should we adopt the Chinese approach, Mr. Annen? And how can we ensure that these investments are sustainable in the long term? That's something that Amaka might want to reply to. Amaka, please do get started.
Okay, let me start with, should we adopt the Chinese approach? I have some views about that. Look, I think that the reason, what the gentleman here describes about China being able to do things in such large scale is because it's a state-driven economy, right? And like I'm sure Mr. Annen will speak more about, it's a lot harder for Germany to get its private economic actors to do stuff because you can't force them to do stuff. It has to be in their interest to do stuff. And that's why I keep going back to Germany needs to articulate very clearly, not just for the Africans or its Latin American allies or its other Asian allies, what its interests are, but it also has to make sure that its own business people understand what those interests are and buy into it, right? So the only thing Germany, so this is even my view, the only thing Germany can do is to make sure that its businesses see the opportunity in Africa to make those investments, because you can't be China. I would not say adopt the Chinese approach, because you can't force your companies to do stuff, but you can be very clear in your articulation. And I do think that not, recognizing the governance challenges without centering your engagement on it is, to me, a big part of that. Because if you keep telling people, and I go back to my sisters, if you keep telling people, oh, it's so bad, human rights, blah, 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 why do they want to go invest there? And a lot of German companies went and invested in China, despite the fact that it has the worst human rights record in the world. But there's still billions of dollars that came from German companies into, and now it's a big market for German exports. The point being, you have to find a way to separate those two things, because especially, I think, in Africa, the respect and the acceptance of democracy as the way to go is very clear. There are people who are failing, there are countries who are failing at it, but the people, by and large, want it. And so if you encourage economic transformation and economic growth, it will ultimately empower those people to push their country, their governments, to do what they want already. You don't have to convince them, because they already want to live in free societies. And so for me, I think it's about talking about those interests and making sure that it permeates down into German companies who can make those investments. Okay. And then the other question, what would have changed in 5 years? Nothing. Nothing, I don't think. I'll leave it up to you.
Antwort finde ich gut. Ja.
Short answer. I do like that.
Also,
Mr. Annen.
Erstmal, nein, wir sollten das chinesische Modell
So first of all, I think
kopieren.
we should not copy the Chinese model.
So wie ich das sehe, ist die Wahrheit aber auch,
In my
mir
view,
das Verzeihen, ein bisschen komplexer.
however, if you excuse me, the truth is a little more complex. Of course, there are these all-inclusive packages, but there's also other things. And there are also German companies that actually make a lot of money in these projects. Or, as a German entrepreneur once said, we wait for the road to break and then we repair it. That way, the work ends up with us. That also exists. But the core of your question touches upon something I really care about. In Germany, we hardly have any companies that are ready to take the leadership in very big projects. And that is the difference to state-organized or state-controlled companies as we see them in China. Now, companies such as Bilfinger Berger or the like are things that don't really exist anymore in Germany. And so many things that are addressed to us as a government, because of course we receive suggestions as a government, but sometimes they are not our decisions to be made. They are decisions to be made by the private sector. And that is why we use this Hamburg conference these past 2 days to actually get the companies to the table and to talk to them. And today I spoke with many entrepreneurs. Most of them were men, but a couple of them were women too. And we had discussions about this, and we discussed about various possibilities of taking over certain guarantees. For instance, a state-owned bank that also makes investments possible in African countries, banks that projects that might not be subject to loans for other banks because they are too risky. But what we shouldn't do is to completely take over the entrepreneurial risk, because in that case we are not talking about entrepreneurs anymore. And that is one of the big differences with regard to China. And that is why we won't be able to copy it, and I also don't want us to copy it. But we can and we have to do more in this regard. And then you asked about the long-term perspective. I think the result of the German development cooperation is actually better than its reputation in many areas, because you also mentioned humanitarian aid earlier on, which is about the immediate survival of people. But in contrast to that, we can look decades ahead and engage in the field of education, health, and many other areas. And here we can affect various types of changes, but they're not always visible because they're not necessarily things that make headlines. But nonetheless, I would like to actually make a bit of publicity for what we do, because in many regions, for instance, the Sahel region, which only has about one democratic government at the moment, we have been active in this region for about 60 years. And despite the crisis there, we have been able to move things forward. And I think that is very important. And so, if I may say one more thing, most of the entrepreneurs I know share our values, but they take entrepreneurial decisions. And they didn't go to China because of the human rights policies. And it also wasn't the reason why they didn't go to China. If they went to China, it was because there was a lot of money to be made there and because there were predictable framework conditions. And of course, we have to understand that these countries exist in Africa too, but there are also countries that do not provide predictable framework conditions. And that's why the investments don't flow into those countries, because they might be autocracies, or because you don't know whether you'll be disowned next year, or whether the country that you conclude is actually valid, or whether the judges that decide what happens with your company in case of a dispute might be corrupt. So these are, of course, factors that also have to be put on the agenda, and the reality in some of these countries is rather complex. With regard to the world in 5 years' time, I think it will be better, because people in Germany and many European countries, and also countries around the globe, understand that it's not only about thinking what will become of me, it's not only about looking at the threats, but it's about improving our model of prosperity. And that's why we'll be looking ahead at the future in a much more confident way, and part of our export-driven growth will have been transformed in a green way. Thank you. I always like to end on a positive note, because we talked about many heavy topics here. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I read a quote by the Indian thinker Raja Mohan, namely, the Global South. Knowing the Global South is the first step towards rapprochement between Europe and the non-Western world. And I think, or I hope, that this evening contributed towards us going a little bit further down that path. So I would like to thank you, Amaka Anku and Niels Annen, for this very vivid discussion, for your time, and to the audience, of course, for all of your questions and your interest. Thank you to the colleagues, Jonathan Lehrer, Julia Harting and Caro Nissen, and the entire team. Thank you for your wonderful support in realizing this discussion, and also thanks to the two interpreters who have been working diligently throughout this event. There are many things that we didn't talk about. I can tell you I have a number of questions on my list. You probably do too. We can always talk about them outside. You are invited to have a drink with us in the foyer, and then we can discuss many of these other topics if you wish. The Hamburg Sustainability Conference also sent us a box. This is a box that you can throw little snippets of paper into with ideas for sustainable development. So if you have any good ideas, that might be one way of extending your discussion or summarizing it and dropping it into that box as a final message. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here.